Conceptualizing good governance. 4. Kautilya'S Arthashastra is an important source of knowledge on polity, economy and administration. However, this important document had been forgotten for centuries. Thanks to Shyamashastri, who first interpreted Kautilya'S economic and political thoughts in a book published in English in 1909, we had insights into the writings of that brilliant mind. Since then, a large number of scholars and ideologists from the East and the West studied the book and found that it was a fascinating source on the ancient Indian political system, economic activity and administration, both public and private. The authenticity of Kautilya'S period, the role he played as prime minister to put an end to the evil regime of the Nandas and create a new rule under Chandragupta Maurya, has been confirmed by scholars the world over. Kautilya'S Arthashastra is basically a book on governance. Political administration and economic administration for good governance are its important aspects. However, the book includes a large number of subjects related to social, political and economic aspects of life. It is an interdisciplinary work running over several chapters, comprising 6,000 Sanskrit verses. The Arthashastra is more a practical guide meant for kings than a theoretical composition. The Arthashastra is a tome on how the king should rule and what aims he should strive for. Kautilya knew the drawbacks of an evil ruler. He knew that even the strong republics that existed in India and later succumbed easily to Persian and Greek invasions, fell primarily because of maladministration. He realized the need for creating a strong and centralized monarchy benevolent to the people. He could visualize the realization of a strong normal rule in place of an evil one. He succeeded in creating an ideal state ruled by an ideal king, Chandragupta Maurya. He administered the kingdom as prime minister and then wrote the Arthashastra as a guideline for the benefit of the king. The relevance of Kautilya'S Arthashastra to present-day India and, indeed, the whole world need not be doubted. The work is relevant in many ways. For example, governance in general and good governance in particular are the most relevant aspects. Those on an endless search for good governance can expect a treasure trove in the Arthashastra. A number of modern thinkers, from Hobbes to Rawls, including Gandhi and Marx, believed that human beings conceded coercive power to the state only in the hope of realizing good governance. Kautilya'S treatise on the art of government and administration, the duties of kings, ministers, officials and art of diplomacy is a guideline on good governance. The king is expected to behave in a righteous manner. In the happiness of his subjects lies his happiness, in their welfare, his welfare. Whatever pleases him personally he shall not consider as good, but whatever makes his subjects happy he shall consider good. Elsewhere Kautilya maintains, the king should look to the bodily comforts of his servants by providing such emoluments as can infuse in them the spirit of enthusiasm to work. He should not violate the course of righteousness and wealth. Thus, he shall not only maintain his servants, but also increase the subsistence and wages in consideration of their learning and work. For Kautilya, Artha, wealth, followed Dharma, righteousness. Artha has a wider connotation than mere wealth, the material well-being of a person being only a part of it. Good governance in Kautilya's mind was aimed at the welfare of the people. The principles of good governance in Kautilya'S Arthashastra are well drawn out. The king has no individuality. His duties merged into his personality. He himself was one of the organs of the state, albeit the most important organ. In Arthashastra, polity and society are merged and both are restrained. In good governance, the objectives of the state are to be fulfilled and realized. This is possible through a properly organized and guided administration. This principle is relevant even today. A government is good if it is administered well. Kautilya suggests that good governance should avoid extreme decisions and extreme actions. Soft actions, sama, dana, and harsh actions, danda, should be taken accordingly. In what seems to be a very modern tone of voice, Kautilya opines, sovereignty is practicable only with the cooperation of others and all. Administrative measures are to be taken after proper deliberations. The king and ministers were supposed to observe strict discipline. Kautilya recommended a strict code of conduct for himself and for his administrators. This code of conduct is useful and applicable to modern executives. Even 2,400 years ago, Kautilya emphasized capping at a quarter of the revenue the salaries of the king and his officials. For good governance, all administrators, including the king, were considered servants of the people. They were paid for the service rendered and not for their ownership of anything. Compare this to the expenses on the salary of government employees today, which constitutes over 50% of the revenue. In some states, even 80% of the revenue is spent on salaries, wages, and pensions. It was the duty of the king to maintain law and order in society and to ensure protection of life, liberty, and property. Dereliction of duty in this respect had to be compensated from the king's property. In modern times, the problem of law and order has become very difficult. Protection of individual liberties does not seem to be always possible. And never, ever, would it be paid for by the personal property of the leader. A good deal of public money is spent on maintaining law and order. No progress and development is possible without law and order administration. Ministers and secretaries are directly responsible for administration. They must be selected with great care. Their abilities must be tested before the selection. They should be tested according to the jobs they will be assigned. Their abilities and sincerities should be tested from time to time. All these measures are relevant to the civil servants in present administration. Kautilya also deals with the problem of corruption. In fact, he points out about 40 ways by which government funds can be embezzled. However, Kautilya has a very realistic perception about dealing with this malaise. He feels that it is difficult to discover the honesty, or otherwise, of an officer. According to Kautilya, for good governance, preventive and punitive measures to punish corrupt civil servants must be adopted. Good governance and stability go hand in hand. If rulers are responsive, responsible, accountable, removable, recallable, there will be stability; if not, there would be instability. This is very essential in the present democratic setup. As in Kautilya's monarchical setup, similar qualities are required in our rulers and administrators. The Arthashastra equates political governance with economic governance. The end is economic governance while political governance is the means. But as economic objectives are not realized in the absence of political ones, then political governance becomes an end and economic governance the means. The end justifies the means. This is supposed to be the basis of Kautilyan and Machiavellian philosophy. Political power and material wealth, according to Kautilya, are the means and ends of governance. And good governance, political or economic, depends upon justifying the ends and means as the socio-economic and political conditions. Good governance is fundamental to the Kautilyan idea of administration. Judging by the countless governance scandals that are uncovered nearly every day in India, a reading of Arthashastra, and imbibing its principles, ought to be the topmost priority for our leaders, both political and corporate. Public governance. 5. Part 1. Principles of Economic Administration. The cardinal principle of economic administration was laid down in Kautilya'S Arthashastra in the following words: the root of wealth is economic activity, and lack of it brings material distress. In the absence of fruitful economic activity, both current prosperity and future growth are in danger of destruction. The king shall populate the countryside by creating new villages on virgin lands or reviving abandoned village sites. Importance of village economy. Whereas Kautilya enjoined upon the king to populate the countryside, unfortunately, in today's India, the reverse is taking place. People from rural areas are migrating to urban centers, resulting in proliferation of slums that become breeding grounds for crime, prostitution, drug trafficking, diseases, etc. The government of India, and state governments, should follow Kautilya's suggestions on decongesting big cities. It is, therefore, heartening to note the former President of India Drive A. P.J. Abdul Kalam's suggestions of initiating the project called Providing Urban Amenities in Rural Areas, very much in line with Kautilyan thoughts. Rajiv Gandhi's Gramin Vidyutikaran Yojana provides incentives for the ruralization of population. Kautilya makes some very useful suggestions in the book, such as arable land should be allotted to taxpayers for their lifetime. Land allotted to all those who do not cultivate it should be confiscated and given to others. The loss suffered by the state due to non-cultivation should be made good by the attending holder of the land. To boost agriculture, Kautilya made it mandatory for the king to protect farmers from being harassed by overdue fines, taxes, and demands for labor. The king would promote trade and commerce by setting up market towns and trade routes, both by land and by water. He should build water resources reservoirs throughout the country and construct wide roads. He should protect trade routes from harassment by his own courtiers, officials, or thieves and frontier guards. In India today, persons dealing in interstate and even intrastate trade experience considerable harassment by officials. It is common knowledge that heavy bribes are paid so that work may proceed smoothly. Concept of mixed economy and public sector. Kautilya was foremost among political economists, who propounded the concept of mixed economy. According to him, the state should run a diversified economy actively, efficiently, prudently, and profitably. For example, any official who did not generate adequate profits in crown undertakings was punished for swallowing the labor of workers. A crucial command was given to the chief controller of state trading that he should generate profits and avoid losses. One wishes that our politicians would read and understand this. When the state's commodities were sold by private merchants, they had to pay a charge to compensate the state for profit, which the state would otherwise have got by selling directly. Thus, it is obvious that for Kautilya the word profit is not anathema but a must in business. Had post-independence socialism in India not derided profits, the financial health of the public sector and indeed of the government which borrowed heavily to finance it would have been vastly better. According to Kautilya, public and private sectors had their own roles to play. Land was in the public sector, the state held all virgin lands, forests and water resources. Arable land was both in public and private sectors. Even mining and fishing were held by both sectors. While the actual making of salt was done by the lessees of salt pans, the chief salt controller collected revenues before it could be marketed. Salt was also imported. The state had monopoly over the manufacture and sale of alcoholic liquor, gambling, prostitution and betting. Further, sale and purchase and manufacture of gold, silver and precious stones were under the control of the state. Local and foreign trade. Both private merchants and the state were involved in local and foreign trade. The chief controller of trading was responsible for the equitable distribution of local and foreign goods, buffer stocks, sale of crown's commodities and public distribution. The chief controller of private trading kept a watch over merchants, inspecting their weights and measurements periodically and ensuring that they did not hoard, adulterate, or add extra markups. Janapadas and economic activity. Most of the productive economic activities took place in the Janapada or self-sufficient villages. According to Kautilya, power comes from the countryside, which is the source of all activity. An ideal Janapada should be capable of producing a wide variety of commodities to support the native population and also immigrants from outside. People should be predominantly agriculturists, artists and craftsmen devoted to work. They should be loyal and intelligent. Other economic activities were trade, building forts and water reservoirs, mining and manufacture. The textile industry was also encouraged. The spinning of yarn was decentralized and was carried out by women. Weaving was both decentralized by contracting work out to weavers on a piece rate basis and was also carried out by the state under its supervision in specially built weaving sheds for special type of cloth. Making of salt was a state monopoly and illegal manufacture of salt was severely punished. Labor and employment were not overlooked or ignored by Kautilya. Women and children had specific roles to play in the schemes of employment both in public and private sectors. An interesting aspect of employment of labor is that wages were related to productivity in some sectors of the economy. A large part of the labor force that worked for a fixed salary was in the state sector. But the total wage bill was not to exceed a fourth of the total revenue. One wishes the Finance Commission goes through these ideas. Self-employed craftsmen formed guilds called srenis and had their own rules and guidelines regarding wages and payments. Linking wages and salaries to productivity is an ideal formula. If implemented, this would go a long way in reducing costs and have a favorable effect on labor output ratio, especially in industries. Budget accounts and audit, revenue budgeting. The councillor in charge of budget making had to first estimate the revenue for the tax year by determining the likely revenue from each sphere of activity under different heads of accounts, total them up by place of activity to arrive at the grand total. Deductions were made for expenditure on the king, standard rations for others and exemptions granted by the king by decree, or orally. Outstanding revenue was estimated by taking into account the works under construction from which revenue was to accrue only on completion, unpaid fines and penalties, dues recoverable and advances to be repaid by officials. Kautilya's method of calculating net revenue was to deduct expenditure from income, taking into account the actual as well as deferred payments. It appears that Kautilya'S methods described above did not allow for budget estimates, revised estimates and actuals, which are practiced in India today by finance ministers. In modern India, alas, the process is reversed. Political compulsions lead to various concessions being granted to different sectors, often vote banks. The expenditure is first determined, and then the exercise to raise revenue from new or existing sources begins. Back to basics, as propounded in the Arthashastra, may be a good practice to follow. Maintenance of account books. In the account books, every entry was to have the date of transaction on the receipt side, whilst revenue was to be classified according to main heads of accounts, viz. cost price, share barga, transaction tax, VAT, monopoly taxes, fixed taxes, manufacturing charges, fines, and penalties. On the debit side, expenditure was classified under II broad heads, such as charitable expenses, palace expenditure, administration, foreign affairs, maintenance of granary, ordnance depots, warehouses, manufacturing expenses, labor charges, defense, cattle and pastures, forests and game sanctuaries and firewood, fodder and other consumables. Strict audit of accounts was recommended. Today, one has only to read various CAG reports to know how badly accounts are maintained by the state agencies in India. Responsibility of auditors was underscored in the Arthashastra. Failure to conform to regulations was a punishable offense. The auditor had to be ready when the accounts officer presented himself for audit, otherwise he would be punished. High officials were responsible for rendering the accounts for the sphere of activity without any contradiction in them. Those who told lies or made contradictory statements were liable to pay a heavy penalty. The quantum of penalties ranged from 12 panas to 200 panas. Similarly, elaborate penalties were imposed on those officials whose activities resulted in a loss to the state, for lying about accounts, for interpolating entries in the accounts, for not being ready for audit and for making contradictory statements in the accounts. Fear of severe punishment kept unscrupulous and irresponsible auditors on guard while they prepared audit reports. Part 2: Governance, Administration, Rule of King. The Manual of Administration in Kautilya'S Arthashastra described the organization of the apparatus of the state and prescribes the duties and responsibilities of every key official, either for maintaining order or for collecting revenues. It also dealt with civil service discipline and the enforcement of people's civic responsibility. The Code of Law and Justice covered both civil and criminal law and was basically a penal code. The extensive and graded penalties and fines prescribed in it had the twin objectives of deterring transgressions and collecting revenue for the state. The state was governed by the king with the assistance of councillors and ministers, through three methods, viz., that which the king saw with his own eyes, that which he knew indirectly through reports submitted to him, and that which he inferred about work not done by knowing about the work that had been done. The king thoroughly investigated all the qualities of any one whom he was considering for appointment as a minister. The king was accessible to his people every day for 1.5 hours after sunrise. When in the court, he would not make petitioners wait at the door, but attend to them promptly himself. Kautilya averred that when the king was inaccessible to the people, they would cross over to the enemy. As mentioned earlier, the basic principle on which governance lay was, in the happiness of his subjects lies his happiness, in their welfare, his welfare. In India today, the situation stands in contrast to what Kautilya enjoined upon the king. Our rulers, viz., ministers, members of parliament, members of legislative assemblies, even district collectors are not easily accessible to the armed janta. As a result, middlemen find a flourishing business to redress the grievances of the people. Alas, in modern India, over a third of our elected MPs have criminal records, and some for the most heinous of crimes. So long as they are only accused but not convicted, and the legal process is slower than the proverbial snail, they can continue to remain elected representatives. Thus, Kautilya'an feudalism, based on the king promoting the welfare of the people, can be adopted to democracy. Civil administration. The king was in charge of an elaborate machinery to control civil administration. The heads of the administration were the Treasurer, Chancellor, Chief Controller, and Auditor. Under the Chancellor were frontier governors, provincial governors, and judges. Under provincial governors were magistrates. Under the Chief Controller and Auditor were city commander, city administrators, ministers, head of manufacturing establishments, and city governor-generals. Under the ministers were forest commanders and Danda Palav, chief forest officers, and the heads of departments directly under Chief Controller and Auditor. Civic service. An honest, efficient and experienced civil service, i.e., bureaucracy, is a sine qua non for efficient, equitable and just governance. Kautilya knew that a few civil servants would feel the temptation to bite into a bit of the state's wealth. Therefore, Kautilya recommended that only those officials who did not eat the king's wealth, but increased it in just ways, should be made permanent in civil service. While an officer negligent or remiss in his work would be fined double his wages and losses incurred, an officer who accomplished a task as ordered or did better than that would be promoted and rewarded. Structure of salaries and wages. Kautilya'S Arthashastra specified the amounts of salaries to be paid to various categories of civil servants. The total salary bill of the state had to be determined in accordance with the city and countryside's capacity to pay, and it was not to exceed 1/4 of the revenue of the state. If the amount of the actual cash in the treasury was inadequate, salaries could be paid partly in cash, and partly in kind. Grain could be substituted for cash wages according to the formula that an annual salary or wage of 60 panas was equal to 1 adaka of grain per day. This is similar to the Food for Work program that has been recently launched in India. The total wage or salary bill not exceeding 1/4 of the state's revenue should have been the model for both central and many state governments that have been spending 50% of their revenue on services and pensions. Frauds and punishment. Kautilya'S Arthashastra details an elaborate salary structure for the king's officials. The highest salary was 48,000 panas per annum, received by the councillors, royal scribe, and royal purohita. The treasurer and the chancellor were entitled to 24,000 panas per annum. The governor-general of the city, Rashtrapala, was paid 12,000 panas per annum. The lowest salary was 60 panas per annum. Kautilya was aware of financial frauds committed by government officials. He observed that they could enrich themselves improperly in two ways: either by cheating the government or by exploiting the public. He prescribed punishment for each type of fraud. He listed 40 ways of stealing government wealth. A few examples mentioned by Kautilya about officials cheating the government include construction using government property for personal profits, falsification of the date of receipt of income, misuse of government property, etc. Consumer protection. The Arthashastra contains measures for consumer protection and the welfare of the people. It has also prescribed how much to pay to artisans, craftsmen, goldsmiths and merchants. To protect consumers, it was made mandatory that all balances and weights were bought from the chief superintendent of weights and measures. It also describes various ways by which merchants cheat consumers, for e.g., fraud in weighing, substitution of original products or ingredients with fake ones. Kautilya also listed the wages to be paid to base metal workers, artisans and craftsmen, weavers, washermen and tailors, doctors, and entertainers. From the several minute details regarding employment, salaries and wages detailed in Arthashastra, it is obvious that unemployment and begging cannot be ruled out in the kingdom. In fact, Kautilya prohibited beggars, entertainers, and mendicants from moving about during the monsoons. The punishment for transgression was whipping with an iron rod. If we examine the kinds of corruption and fraud committed by the king's officials, we realize that nothing significant has changed over the centuries. The difference is that in many cases the government officials get away unpunished for their misdeeds in present India, whereas strict punishments were slapped on corrupt officials in earlier times. The punishments range from wealth punishments to the lowest standard penalty. In some cases, public humiliation was recommended, such as smearing the face and body with cowdung and parading the errant official in public areas, or shaving off their hair. Can such punishments be meted out in India today? Even if a law is passed in the Parliament, it could be challenged by the accused in the court of law. Since a few lawmakers have themselves been accused of crimes, it is highly unlikely that they would want to legislate penal proceedings. 3. Conclusion. Is Kautilya'S Arthashastra relevant to India today? It is true that the ideal state Kautilya envisaged in his treatise was a feudal monarchy, where the king was the sole master of his kingdom. Democratic India today has a federal polity and governments, both at the center and at the states, depending on the votes cast by the electorate. The state cannot have its own way on many issues, even if it wants to follow methods and measures suggested in Arthashastra. Legislature, judicature, executive and public opinion, freedom of the press, are the four pillars of democracy. Despite its constraints, India can benefit from the wisdom of Kautilya as expressed in Arthashastra. When he, Kautilya, discusses the economy, just administration or relations between states-nations, we can learn from his wisdom. Kautilya's state was run on the principle of dharma, righteousness. Compared to Kautilya's emphasis on rural, village development, the high importance he gave to agriculture and decentralization of textile industry today, one finds these areas are neglected. Unlike in Kautilya's state where the king was accessible to his people every day at least for 1.5 hours, in India, today, it takes a long time to even get a hearing from the state when people approach it. In the sphere of economic administration also, India has much to learn from Arthashastra. Kautilya recommends severe penalties on officials of public enterprises who incur losses, and rewards for those who showed profits. Profit was a must in Kautilya's scheme of running public enterprises, unlike the way things are now. Though Kautilya'S Arthashastra was written in the 3rd century BC, the book is relevant to India even in the 21st century. The ground rules and measures suggested in it, especially in matters relating to the budget, accounts and audits, are applicable even today to Indian conditions. Witness the innumerable frauds mentioned in the CAG reports. In Kautilya's state, the king could take action against erring officials and severely punish them, however highly placed they were. In India, IAS officers of the rank of Joint Secretary and above cannot be arrested without clearance from higher authorities, even when they are caught red-handed by the Anti-Corruption Bureau or CBI. The auditors in Arthashastra were liable to pay severe fines and be penalized for any wrongdoing. They could not escape their accountability to the crown. India could adopt such measures to tighten the audits of public and private sector companies. In conclusion, the relevance of Kautilya'S Arthashastra to India today so far as governance is concerned is: firstly, Kautilya's state had adopted a mixed economy structure, in which public, private, and joint ventures of both public and private sectors functioned side by side. At present, India also has a similar economic framework. What with the state having a share, often a major share, in some companies, it has all the three types in the economy. India should make profit the main objective for its public enterprises. Secondly, high priority should be given to agriculture, water reservoirs, road building and forest development as suggested by Kautilya. Thirdly, people should have easy access to the state's high officials to get the grievances redressed. There should be no harassment of people by tax collectors, customs and tax officials. Officials who harass people should be dealt with severely. Fourthly, rural areas and villages should be developed to decongest population in urban areas and cities. Industries should be decentralized and employment, especially of women, should be given priority. Kautilya's observation that the state depends on the prosperity of villages and village population echoes Gandhiji's view on the subject. Fifthly, auditors should be dealt with severely if they fail in their duties and for their omissions and commissions which cause losses to the state. Lastly, irrespective of political party in power, the government both at the center and at the state level should realize that the state is for the welfare of the people and people are not there to serve it as acolytes or servants. Kautilya emphasized this wisdom in Arthashastra. Agriculture. 6. Kautilya had a brilliant mind, which was both realistic and intuitive. This is evident from his approach to managing agriculture. The Arthashastra states that the main activities of the economy were agriculture, cattle rearing, and commerce. Among the three, Chanakya considered agriculture to be the most important constituent of the economy. Arthashastra, with its focus on the importance of agriculture, is surely a source of inspiration and learning in today's India, given its wisdom on economic development and growth. Arthashastra pointed out that the responsibility of a government was not, of course, limited to ensuring the proper planning and allocation of central funds but also proper management and implementation of policies in accordance with standards and procedures. Kautilya was of the opinion that a king must also learn about agriculture. It extends, too, over the whole of the general government sector, including regions, districts and municipalities, as well as central government institutions. This task can be extremely difficult where there is a large degree of decentralization accompanied by shortages in management and audit capacity. Kautilya opined that the government should also ensure strong financial management systems to be introduced in agencies and organizations at the village level which interface with the public and private sectors. Such systems should also be in place in public corporations that are subject to government regulation. This is not ruling out the fact that in all of these, sound and reliable standards of governance are often needed. A major focus in Arthashastra is the role of citizens in the agricultural sector. It suggested the provision of a special officer titled Kautilya'S or Superintendent of Agriculture, for Crown lands. The book also contained information related to farmers in general as it was meant to inform and advise the superintendent with regard to increasing the production on the lands owned by the Crown. During Kautilya's time, agriculture, cattle breeding, and trade were grouped into a category called Vata. Kautilya indicated that agriculture should receive policy and administrative support from government officials. For production of crops, supply of good seed and other purchases, inputs need to be arranged. Assistance had been provided to make available other resources such as labor, machinery, implements, and bullocks. Contingency plans were made for alternative crops in case the monsoon failed or floods occurred. Irrigation was provided wherever the water source existed. Arrangements were made to protect crops, harvest, and to safely store the produce. The Arthashastra has a lot of valuable information about the management of agriculture, measurement of rainfall, astrology, and astronomy related to agriculture, meteorological aspects of agriculture, kinds of crops, advantage in cultivating certain classes of crops, the growth of crops, treatment of seeds, manuring, and harvesting. The taxation issue is also well addressed. Possessed with knowledge of the science of agriculture, water management, and managing crops and trees, or assisted by those who are trained in such sciences, the superintendent of agriculture shall in time collect the seeds of all kinds of grains, flowers, fruits, vegetables, bulbous roots, fruits of creepers, fiber-producing plants such as hibiscus and cotton. In Kautilya's time, clear orders were issued to the superintendent to make sure that the farmers and the laborers were not hampered in their activities and that their work did not suffer. The work of the above men shall not suffer on account of any want of plows and other necessary implements, or of bullocks. Nor shall there be any delay in procuring for them the assistance of blacksmiths, carpenters, basket sellers, rope makers, as well as those who catch snakes, and similar persons. Any loss in production because of the above persons should invite fine equal to the loss. Meteorology. Even in Kautilya's times, weather forecasting was of prime importance and people possessed a high level of meteorological knowledge. 3 are the clouds that continuously rain for 7 days, 80 are they that pour minute drops, and 60 are they that appear with the sunshine. This is called rainfall. Where rain, free from wind and unmingled with sunshine, falls so as to render 3 turns of plowing possible, there the reaping of good harvest is certain. The forecast of rain was made by observing planets, viz., the position, movement and cloudiness of Jupiter, from the rise, setting, and movement of Venus, and from changes in the appearance of the sun. In regions where cultivation was dependent solely on the rain, land was classified as suitable for dry crops if the rainfall was about 16 dronas, about 25 inches, a year, and for wet crops, if the rainfall was 1.5 times that, about 37.5 inches a year. A good rainy season was when 1/3 of the annual rainfall occurs at the beginning, Srayana July, August, and at the end of the season, Kartika October, November, and 2/3 in the middle, Prashtapada August, September, and Aswayuya in September. About 13.5 dronas in the country of Asmakas, 23 dronas in Avanti, and an immense quantity in western countries, Apatanam, the borders of the Himalayas, and the countries where water channels are made use of in agriculture, Kalayavapanam. Ownership of land. Scholars differ on the point of the prevalence of private ownership of land in ancient India. But so far as Arthashastra is concerned, it recognizes private ownership in land, though it presupposes the existence of state-owned or crown lands. All unoccupied land belonged to the state. Unoccupied land was allotted to villages. The grants of the agricultural land were made for the farmer's lifetime only, meaning that the farmers were not absolute owners. However, the description and existence of Kautilya'S proves the existence of state farms. Nevertheless, lands not under the supervision of the Kautilya'S belonged to private owners. Records of agricultural and other properties in the villages were maintained by the Gopis and the Stanikas, who worked under the Samahat and were in no way related to the Kautilya'S. Moreover, the Kshetrika, the owner of the field, was distinguished from the Upavasa, the tenant. When neither party could prove the claim in connection with disputes regarding boundaries between two fields, the disputed territory was surrendered to the king. Likewise, if the owner of a land was not traced, the land was then controlled by the king. Arthashastra also mentioned the gift of land to priests, preceptors, and others, in the form of grants to Brahmins. Thus, in Kautilyan times, there was private ownership of land, although mines belonged to the state. Cropping pattern. The Arthashastra enjoined that a handful of seeds bathed in water be sown first and the following mantra recited. Prajapati Kasyapaya Devya Nama, Sada Sita Medyutam Devai Bijeshu Char Dineshu Char. Chandavata Hey. This means, salutation to God Prajapati Kasyapa. Agriculture may always flourish and the goddess may reside in seeds and wealth. Chandavata He. Kautilya showed farmers the advantage of cultivating different classes of crops, which is relevant even today. Rice crops and the like are the best. Vegetables are intermediate, and sugarcane is the worst, very difficult to grow, for it is subject to various evils and requires much attention and expenditure to reap. His words are quite relevant today in India to farmers, as well as the state agricultural departments, as they can advantageously use this advice to the benefit. In fact, India has one of the world's highest production of sugarcane and, not surprisingly, one of the lowest levels of groundwater resources. Arthashastra says that anyone who brought new land under cultivation is to be granted exemption from payment of agricultural taxes for 2 years. Though Kautilya advised the king to be firm and relentless in the execution of the state policy, he adopted a very soft attitude towards the flora and fauna of the land as also towards the animals on land. Causing pain to quadrupeds or cutting tender shoots were regarded as punishable offenses. Fruit and flower-bearing plants were under the special care of the state. In Arthashastra, several chapters are devoted to animal husbandry. Kautilya dealt with various kinds of animals, their herding, grooming, training, marking, feeding, and milking. In fact, the state owned large herds of cattle. At the same time, cattle were also owned privately. The Godyaksha, the superintendent of cattle, maintained a complete record of animals in all the herds belonging to the state. Irrigation. Kautilya'S Arthashastra established the rules for building reservoirs and dams, and mentioned irrigated fields being more valuable than rain-fed fields. For building or improving irrigation facilities, the following examples for payment of water rates were granted by Arthashastra. New tanks and embankments, 5 years. Renovating ruined or abandoned waterworks, 4 years. Cleaning waterworks overgrown with weeds, 3 years. Anyone leasing, hiring, sharing or accepting waterworks as a pledge, with the right to use them, had to keep them in good condition. The owner could give water to others by dredging channels or building suitable structures, in return for a share of the produce grown in the fields, parks or gardens. In the absence of an owner, either charitable individuals or the people of the village acting together had to maintain waterworks. Unfortunately, post-independent India has not fully utilized its water resources. Though the population has nearly doubled since independence, the area for major crops under cultivation has grown only 10%. Wheat is the only exception, for which the gross area under cultivation has almost doubled. Currently, 27 million hectares area is under wheat cultivation. Old cropping patterns, old varieties of seeds, old methods of production are no longer sufficient or relevant. In order to feed 1 billion people, we now need improved varieties of crop species, increases in productivity and extended irrigation projects. Water has to be harnessed. Traditional irrigation projects had their limitations. They could not always prevent famine and floods. Besides, there were social dimensions too. They were always linked to caste hierarchy, with dominant landholders of a village controlling even the decentralized tanks. As stated in Arthashastra, the government needs to realize that irrigated fields are more valuable than rain-fed fields to help increase agricultural productivity. Agricultural taxation. The Arthashastra advocated against excessive taxation and stated that both extremes should be avoided, namely, either complete absence of taxes or exorbitant taxation. The taxes for agriculturists varied between 1/6, 1/8, and 1/10 of the produce depending upon their circumstances. This taxation was not progressive but proportional to fluctuating incomes. An excess profit tax was also collected. Profit margins. Arthashastra indicated the profit margin allowed to merchants as 1-5% for locally produced goods, and 2-10% for imported goods. Price support. Arthashastra states that when the supply of a commodity is in excess of demand, the chief controller of state trading has to build up a buffer stock by paying a price higher than the market price. When the market price reaches the support level, he shall change the price, according to the situation. Futures. Similarly, the price of any commodity was fixed taking into account the investment made, the quantity to be delivered, duty, interest, rent and other expenses. Sustainable farming. While talking of sustainable farming, the following words are relevant. The seeds of grains are to be exposed to mist and heat for 7 nights. The seeds of coffee, mung bean, black gram, etc. are treated similarly for 3 to 5 nights. The seeds of sugarcane and the like are plastered at the cut end in a mixture of honey, lard, ghee and cowdoing. Seeds of bulbous roots with honey and ghee, cotton and hard seeds with cow dung, and pits for trees are to be burnt, and manured with bones and cowdoing on proper occasions. Kautilya'S Arthashastra is a treasure trove of scientific information on a variety of subjects including agriculture. It is now universally acknowledged that no long-term economic growth program is feasible in India without including the development of the agricultural sector. Before we understand the relevance of Kautilya'S management strategy, especially for Indian agriculture, it is important to understand the current status of Indian agriculture. Current status of agriculture in India. The agricultural sector has a vital place in India's economic development as it represents 22% of the country's gross domestic product (GDP) and provides livelihood to 58% of the country's population and accounts for 1/6 of the total value of the country's exports. In the emerging post-WTO world economic order, India is widely expected to benefit in the area of agriculture. This is one area in which India can emerge as a potential global competitive player. The WTO rules and regulations have focused on the rate of tariffs and widening the market for global competitors. In order to harness the potential of agro-exports, however, adequate rural infrastructure and facilities need to be provided. In India, it is only from the 4th five-year plan that the agricultural sector received priority status, with plan outlays being more than doubled. More than financial support to the agricultural sector, its growth has been stultified because of politics and being a state subject under the Constitution. This has led to several inefficiencies, including restrictions on interstate movement of goods, excessive subsidies on certain types of fertilizers leading to their overuse, and price support systems that encourage cropping patterns not necessarily based on market economics. Consequently, competitiveness and development has taken a backseat. The development of rural road networks has been ignored for years, which is essential to bring Indian agriculture onto a global competitive platform. As a result of poor roads and the absence of a cold storage chain, it is estimated that 1/3 of fruits and vegetables harvested get lost in transit. Little wonder that productivity in India is amongst the lowest in the world. The percentage share of the investment and capital formation in agriculture to gross capital formation in the country has shown a steep decline. It is now just under 8% compared to over 15% a few years ago. Equally, the issue of availability of additional irrigation facilities has also not been sufficiently emphasized. It is sad that even after over a decade of reforms, the sector has to rely on the vagaries of monsoon. This is reflected in the growth of agricultural produce that registered a drop in production for 4 fiscal years since 1991, initialization of reforms. Even prior to 1996, agricultural growth had averaged at 3.3% per year between 1980 and 1995. Of course, the fact that India has achieved self-sufficiency in food grain production is a matter of pride. However, it has yet to exploit its full potential in the export of agricultural goods. The need thus arises to study the implications of globalization on Indian agriculture. We need to take a holistic approach by studying areas of strength and weakness and have policies that encourage productivity and exports and not merely protect political constituencies. One can say that India's low export of agricultural products could be attributed to 3 major reasons. Quality standards, competitive pricing, the terms and conditions upon which import substitution is encouraged. Farmers are now being persuaded to switch over to organic farming and thus phase out the consumption of chemical fertilizers. Organic farming should be used as the most appropriate environment-friendly mechanism to arrest further degradation of the environment. Constant use of pesticides not only pollutes the basic formative components of ecology, but also affects human and cattle health. For instance, spraying endosulfan on cashew crops in Kasaragod, Kerala caused mental disorders among people who lived nearby. The government, through the state marketing boards, needs to play a vital role in promoting standardization, grading, quality certification, market-led extensions and training farmers and market functionaries in marketing-related areas. Indian agriculture suffers from a mismatch between food crops and catch crops, low yields per hectare except for wheat, volatility in production and wide disparities of productivity over regions and crops. Domestic production of pulses and oilseeds are still below the domestic requirements and India imports pulses and edible oils to bridge the gap. Government procurement policy, which guarantees a minimum price for rice and wheat crops to farmers, has created a bias in the favor and a distortion of cropping pattern which is not market determined. At times these procurement policies result in such surpluses of food grain that, due to inadequate storage facilities, the beneficiaries of food subsidies are Indian rats. The movement of agricultural produce which, according to the Indian constitution, is a state subject, is also restricted, thereby depriving the Indian farmer the benefit of a naturally large domestic market. Relevance. Interestingly, the relevance and importance of an agro-based sector continues even today. Kautilya outlined these issues 2,400 years ago. It seems that Arthashastra has a solution to most of the problems in India. To begin with, Arthashastra suggested the creation of a post for a superintendent of agriculture and identified the importance of agriculture in the country. The book also argues that the king should understand the intricacies of agriculture. Commercialization of agriculture, especially of large farms, would be needed with professionally trained managers able to study the global movement of prices, modern farming techniques and use of technologies such as satellite farming. Courses on farm management need to be more widespread. Similarly, agriculture is completely out of the tax regime in India. The agricultural sector that has been given priority status for bank lending gets completely deprioritized when it comes to taxation. As against this, the Arthashastra has highlighted the significance of taxes on agriculture and its allied activities, though it was one of the sole major sectors contributing to state welfare. Arthashastra insisted that the richer farmer be taxed, which should perhaps be done now when the finance minister is trying to find ways to increase the ratio of tax to GDP. The importance of irrigation and providing amenities should be taken up on a priority basis. The economy which has to compete with the international market is yet depending on the vagaries of monsoon. Although India has the second largest irrigated area in the world, the area under assured irrigation or with at least minimal drainage is inadequate. Some of the fertile land has lost its fertility because of inadequate fertilizers or incorrect usage of fertilizers and in incorrect proportions. This is the result of prolonged subsidies on nitrogenous fertilizer, urea, while no such subsidy was given for phosphatic and potassic fertilizers, thereby encouraging farmers to overuse what was available, leading to the permanent loss of soil quality. Thus, a subsidy initiated for the benefit of the farmers is actually working to the permanent detriment. The emphasis on organic farming, which obviates the need to use chemical fertilizers, is an obvious alternative. Given the fact that India has one of the few natural factories for organic manure, one wonders why organic farming has not yet got the attention it deserves. This would also help prevent the slaughter of cattle. The cattle is slaughtered once they are of no commercial use. However, if their manure provides a revenue stream to the farmer, he would be averse to slaughtering them. Kautilya, with his love for animals, would agree. Systematic cropping patterns and irrigation systems followed by the Kautilya Raj is what today's experts need to adapt. Farmers and consumers would benefit if all agricultural production was produced by ecologically sound and sustainable means. Pricing and marketing agro products and providing adequate infrastructure are equally crucial. Of all the factors, the cost of production is the most tangible factor that decides the price, and it takes into account all operational and fixed demands. To conclude, one can positively say that application and validity of quite a few of the suggestions of Arthashastra can be tested, which will benefit the farmers today.